Made the Duke of Windsor, the former King of England, king once again, but not of Great Britain, but of Germany. Searching the published biographies of the Duke of Windsor, this interesting little 1946 plot has seemingly been overlooked by historians and journalists. In order to understand how the plot came about, it is necessary to understand something of the circumstances that led to the Duke of Windsor being an ex-king, possibly for hire. Known as David to his family, he had succeeded to the British throne in 1936 upon the death of his father, King George V. David reigned as King Edward VIII and was also Emperor of India. A popular figure, Edward had been a playboy Prince of Wales whose only real interest appeared to have been sleeping with other men's wives. Then he met Wallace Warfield Simpson, a twice-divorced American, and fell deeply in love that Edward might marry Wallace and make her his queen. Edward became king the year Hitler began testing the waters regarding his plans for German expansion in Europe. Edward was, as has been noted by many who knew him, a natural fascist, and stated that he felt more German than English, being fluent in the language. In fact, Edward was more German than English, his mother being Princess Mary of Teck, a German princely state, and his late father, King George V, being almost completely German. His father, Edward VII, was the son of Queen Victoria, a Hanoverian princess, and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg und Gotha. George V's mother was Alexandra of Denmark, herself mostly German. So, by ancestry, King Edward VIII was almost entirely German, with a slight dash of Hungarian from his mother's side. Therefore, his love of all things German was understandable. What was less understandable was his admiration for Adolf Hitler. When Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland in 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, he expected some military reaction from France and Britain. But evidence has emerged that Edward threatened to precipitate an abdication crisis if Britain stood up to Hitler. Britain and France did nothing, emboldening Hitler to more territorial grabs and putting Europe on the road to war in 1939. Even more worrisome for the British establishment was Edward's evident unfitness to be king. Hitler's ambassador to Great Britain before the war was Joachim von Ribbentrop, who formed a close, and some say extremely close, relationship with Wallace Simpson. He mentioned information at a diplomatic reception that could only have come from secret cabinet meetings. The monarch receives state papers the same as the Prime Minister does, and these confidential reports should not be shared with anyone. However, it was clear that Edward had told Wallace about confidential information, and that she in turn had told von Ribbentrop. If anyone else had done such a thing, a charge of treason would have been contemplated. This and other problems with Edward led to a plot developing among the establishment to get rid of Edward as king. The plotters used the issue of Edward's stated wish to marry Mrs. Simpson as the pretext, and Edward foolishly played straight into their hands by giving the government an ultimatum. Either he would marry Wallace or he would abdicate. The Prime Minister chose the latter option, and Edward abdicated after barely a year on the throne, his brother Bertie taking over as King George VI. Edward and Wallace went to France and married. Though Edward was not banished officially from Britain, he nonetheless entered a period of self-imposed exile that would last for most of his life until his death in 1972. The problem for the British government was Edward's continued interest in Hitler. In 1937 he and Wallace visited Germany, actually meeting Hitler at the Berghof. What Hitler and Edward discussed has never been fully revealed, but Hitler definitely saw Edward as a friend of Germany. When war broke out, Edward, now titled the Duke of Windsor, was attached as a major general to the British military mission in France. According to German sources, Edward had leaked Allied war plans for the defense of Belgium to the Germans, helping Hitler's 1940 invasion. Fleeing France ahead of the Germans, Edward and Wallace set up a house in neutral Lisbon in Portugal when Britain and her empire stood alone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered Edward to return to Britain, threatening a court-martial if he refused. Thereafter, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were packed off to the British colony of the Bahamas in the Caribbean, with Edward appointed governor to keep him out of harm's way. He remained in that post until March 1945, when he started making noises about some future role. In September, Edward and Wallis returned to Europe, she to reopen their old French mansion, which, incredibly, had been carefully guarded by the German army during the occupation of France, and he to Britain to see his mother, Queen Mary, for the first time in 9 years, and his brother, King George VI. During the meeting, it was made clear to Edward that his wife would not be received by the royal family, and that he would not be given any further jobs. Though Edward was independently extremely wealthy, he desired above all 2 things: some useful role, and the granting of the title HRH, or Her Royal Highness, to his wife, specifically denied her. Whilst all letters and documents held in the archives of their German cousins at Marburg Castle, in order to keep potentially damaging information about the royal family out of the newspapers. Among the documents were German intelligence files on the Duke of Windsor and his Nazi ties that would have proven damaging to the royal family if published. Naturally, both the royal family and the British government would have preferred it if Edward stayed in France doing the celebrity party circuit, but Edward was fairly thick-skinned and kept pushing of the famous noble family of diplomats, asking whether the Duke of Windsor would be prepared to accept the throne, not of Britain, but the throne of Hanover. This letter came out of the blue and was something of a shock to the British authorities. The Bentinck letter went on to explain that, quote, after Germany's fatal experiences during the last 25 years, many people in Germany believe that a British form of constitutional monarchy would be the most suitable form of government. Bentinck added that, quote, the personality of the Duke would certainly appeal to the German people, end quote. Hanover and Britain have, of course, a long history. In 1714, following the end of the Scottish Stuart dynasty in Britain, the Elector of Hanover was crowned as King George I of Great Britain, Ireland, and Hanover, beginning a personal union between Britain and Hanover that lasted until 1837, when the 2 houses' personal union ended, though Queen Victoria, who succeeded to the British throne that year, was nonetheless a Hanoverian princess. The Duke of Windsor remained by descent from Queen Victoria, closely related to the Dukes of Hanover. Though declassified in 1977, 5 years after the Duke of Windsor's death, the story of the plot remains largely unknown today and unremarked upon by historians. But I think that it demonstrates that Edward was prepared to examine any avenues to a return to public life,